Welcome back to Stonehard Sports. Today, we are going to be diving into some fantasy football. I'm going to go over some of my favorite and best values for the ADP for a bunch of different sites, including ESPN. Now, throughout the video, I'll determine whether ESPN is kind of really far or really, ahead of this player, because ESPN's rankings are honestly a little bit different than some of the other sites out there, but I'll denote that as the video goes on. But as always, enjoy the video and go ahead and leave a comment. Let me know what your favorite sleepers are for the upcoming season and maybe where you think I'm right or wrong. So let's jump right into the video. As you can see, Kyler Murray will be the first player on our list, but before I dive into him, I just wanted to go over some things real quick. First, I run a lot of half PPR leagues. That's kind of my thing I do. I prefer half PPR. I think it's the best balance between no PPR and full PPR. If you don't know, PPR means points per reception. For any player that catches a pass, they receive a point. It's half a point. But these rankings are slightly a mix of both, but probably a little bit more so in the PPR section, just because that's the one that a lot of these rankings show the most. But I would say for certain players that I was really, specific on, it would be half PPR, but I'll denote that as the video goes on. Remember, this is value based on ADP. You could put it as sleepers if you want. I just say the best values, because if I do a sleepers video, it would be a lot of guys that maybe you're not going to even care about until week 14, and this video would not be as, helpful. But there are a little bit of sleepers kind of at the bottom, but this is more so the best values. So obviously some players that go ahead of any of my picks, like CMC, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, like those guys you need to draft 1, 2, 3. So it's not like I don't like them. It's just they're not values, because that's probably where they should be going, and that's where they are going. So there you won't see really a lot, I think, if any, first round players. Maybe one that could slightly sneak into the first round if you love them, but other than that, just remember, it's the best value, not necessarily just these are the best players I like in fantasy football, because that wouldn't really help you a ton. But this video is really meant for just showing how you can take advantage of the picks that you have to the best of their ability and get the best value, because that's where people really win their leagues. So let's start off with the first player, and that is Kyler Murray, quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals. His ADP is around QB 9, which would put him as a late 6th round pick. He was 9th in points per game for quarterbacks last year once he came back from his injury. Obviously, the first few games he was fully coming back after he had his major injury the season prior, so he did not play a majority of the first half, or all the first half of the season, but he didn't play a majority of the year anyways. But now he's back fully healthy. He only is adding talent. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr., who is probably going to be a real wide receiver 1 immediately and is being drafted as such, as he's being drafted as a late first-round pick. Now he adds Marvin Harrison Jr. He has Trey McBride, who had a very big breakout with Kyler once he came back last year. Trey McBride was a mid-round pick in last year's draft, or 2 years ago, and last year was kind of the year with Kyler that he had a pretty solid breakout. He was, I think, a top 3 tight end during that stretch where Kyler came back. Now they got a full year together. James Conner was very good last year, very underrated, very efficient, and now they add Trey Benson, so I think that helps the backfield a ton, which I don't think necessarily takes away from Kyler Murray, because they're not trying to say, hey, we need to get James Conner the ball, but it really sets up easier passing downs, easier rushing downs for Kyler Murray, because that's obviously the biggest thing, is that he is a rushing quarterback. Now, my leagues, I do 6-point passing touchdown and rushing touchdown. I just don't like how a touchdown's worth less if you pass it, just because some quarterbacks get more. I think that's dumb. Like, why would you not just get running quarterbacks all the time? So if you're in leagues with 4-point passing touchdown, there is no reason for you to not get a running quarterback at all. That's why all the running quarterbacks are the highest, and even guys slightly lower, like a Kyler, like a Jaden Daniels, if you would like that as well. you just need to target those players because there's no point in getting anyone else. But even just assuming you're in a 6-point passing touchdown, this is still a very good value for Kyler Murray. He now obviously has a full offseason of him being fully healthy with the new offensive coordinator and regime, which I wasn't very high on going into the year, but the offensive coordinator actually showed to be pretty solid with Kyler in that second half of the season when he came back. So drafting him at 9 when he was QB9 last year, coming back from an injury, not having Marvin Harrison Jr. I know they also added Zay Jones as well, who I like as a slot. He's solid. Greg Dortch is a good wide receiver 4. And then they have Michael Wilson, who is being thrusted into a starting role, but he's going into his second season. So I think you could expect improvement from him as well. So everything around him is improved. He's now fully healthy, and he's being drafted as if nothing has changed at QB9. I just think it's very good value. So Kyler Murray is a guy that I've definitely been targeting, and I think if he's available in that late 6th, early 7th round, and you haven't gotten a quarterback yet, I think it would be a perfect guy to set your team up with. Next is going to be Kirk Cousins. Kind of shocking, I know, but this is more of, I think, a safe bet play, and he's going as kind of a pretty low-ranked quarterback. His ADP is QB 19, which would be around the middle of the 11th round. And I know people are worried about, the situation that he has, which I know that does have merit because of his injury and then drafting a new quarterback, but I think we're freaking out a little too much. He played 8 games last year before his injury. He finished 7th in fantasy points per game, which I think the 8 games is a pretty solid sample size to, really feel about. I think a lot of times people project based on 2 or 3 games last year for, players that are going to break out the next season. Kirk Cousins has played for a while, and he was 7th in points per game with 8 games. I think that's a pretty telling sign of how the season was gonna turn out for him. And the injury that he had is not going to really be something that's going to affect him throwing the ball. And if you look or just even research a lot of the doctors and stuff that are talking about it, it doesn't seem to be something that's going to 100% fully linger on and affect him the whole year in terms of it's going to derail his season. Kind of like Joe Burrow last year. The injury he had really kind of stopped the season from actually starting. That is probably not going to be the case with Kirk Cousins. Obviously, the age does worry you at 36 years old. But again, he's not a runner anyways. We know that. So I don't think it's really going to affect him anyways because his mind is still the same, arm's still the same. Nothing above the waist was injured. So I think he's going to be fine. But now he's on a new team. And it's honestly not insanely different. Yeah, it obviously it absolutely is because Justin Jefferson is not there. But if you really think about it, I think the totality of the weapons that are around him makes it very similar. And I think that's because you look at everything. 2 good tackles, which he had in Atlanta now. He had 2 good tackles in Minnesota. Except this time, with the Falcons, he probably has the best guard in football in Chris Lindstrom, which helps everyone, obviously. It doesn't just help the running back, that helps the whole team. A star young tight end, in my opinion, for sure, in Kyle Pitts, and a very good young wide receiver in Drake London. Both who have yet to be fully unlocked, and I think they clearly have shown flashes, and I'm really buying in that they're going to be unlocked with Kirk Cousins this season. A stud running back group with Bijan Robinson, who is ready to break out in year 2, Tyler Algier, who is a amazingly good RB2 on this team, and a new regime who, while they can't draft to save their life, at least that's what they've shown, I do feel solid about their overall play calling and coaching ability. But he's a safe bet if you want to swing high on an upside quarterback, or you really just want to wait and just want to punt quarterback completely. You could go Kirk Cousins, and when I say high upside, I'm saying Anthony Richardson, Jaden Daniels, those kind of guys. They do have injury concerns, and so if you want to take upside on them, which they have very high upside in terms of they could be a top 2 QB. In Anthony Richardson's case, he could be QB1 if all goes well. I think Kirk Cousins would be a great pick behind them because, while I wouldn't do the same with Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen because they're proven guys and I wouldn't waste a backup quarterback spot on them, Anthony Richardson and Jaden Daniels, they have some worrisome stuff surrounding them, so Kirk Cousins would be a pretty good pickup if you go down one of those routes. And you can get him pretty cheap in maybe round 12 or so if people don't really love his health or are concerned or think he's boring. he may be boring, but he's going to be pretty consistent and get you some points, and I think definitely outperform his ADP. Next is going to be two guys that are honorable mentions for me. The first one is Bo Nix. I'm not saying that you need to draft Bo Nix, but I do think it's pretty free, to be honest. Nix, I think he's got just a very high floor. He's quarterback 24, which would be around round 15 to 16. He's the most experienced quarterback prospect ever coming out of Oregon. Obviously, also played at Auburn. But I think, it goes to the known QB whisperer in Sean Payton, so I think that helps a ton. He can also run. He's not just stationary. He's like a younger Drew Brees type. Obviously, the offense won't be really good or anything, but I don't think they're going to be totally horrible. And I think Nix can still make a fantasy impact with his running and just minimal turnovers. And it's just he doesn't have as high of a ceiling. But it also looks like he's getting some great reports out of camp as well, and that they're very high on him. So I think he'll easily win the starting job. And I don't think he's going to be some star or anything, but I think with him, I think he was the last quarterback in terms of the big, 5 that were taken. He was the last one in the first round that was taken. I think there will be guys ahead of him that do bust, and Nix will go above them. I don't think he'll end up being the best quarterback in this class, but I don't think he's necessarily going to be someone they look back on like, oh yeah, he sucked, we shouldn't have taken him. Like, I think he'll be solid. I think he'll be fine. He probably won't improve a crazy amount after this year, but I think his ADP for sure will, because I think they're just projecting certain guys to be better than him. I don't think it's going to be that bad. If you have an injury or if you have a QB that has some risky injury history, maybe go ahead and take a look at Bo Nix later on in your fantasy draft. And then the next one is going to be Justin Fields. Now, Justin Fields, this one I think is obviously if you can't take him being like, oh, I maybe be able to start him early in the year. No, that's not why you're taking him. But I think the value is pretty good, if I would say. I mean, he was a top 12 quarterback in points per game last year. He will for sure play at some point during the season. Not that I hate Russell Wilson, but I don't know if the leash is very long for him. Justin Fields, he's being drafted on average as QB 25. He's QB 29 in ESPN, so it's basically free around round 15. So if you don't get a top QB, you could pair someone who's going to start for sure, and then maybe get some later on upside in Justin Fields, and maybe later down the year. Obviously, I don't think he's going to be a superstar. I never really did, but I mean, he wasn't necessarily that last year, and he was a top 12 quarterback. So I don't see why you wouldn't, obviously depending on your quarterback situation, go for the high upside and get Fields, and maybe he can be a trade asset for you later down the line of some guy who has a big injury at quarterback or doesn't like his quarterback situation. If you took a really solid one and then get Fields really late, you might get some good stuff back for him. So I think those two guys are also good quarterbacks to look at later on in your fantasy drafts. Next, going to the running back position, and the first running back we're going to start off with is De'Von Achane. He is currently being drafted around halfback 10. He's halfback 13 in ESPN, so not even a top 12 running back for them. And he is going around the late second round. I would say you could say early third, but I think late second is definitely kind of for sure where he's going to go, because I think if whoever is around that range would see him and be like, okay, I kind of have to take him because maybe he can do this and that, But I think it's almost a little too low, to be honest. I know the risk, but I think in fantasy, you need to go big or go home. I mean, that's how you win leagues. The whole point is winning leagues. A majority of your leagues, some of them obviously give second/third place prizes of you getting your money back, but the majority of leagues are, hey, you win, you get it all. And so I think a lot of people, sometimes are worried about not losing it to do their fantasy punishment, which is fine. But the odds of you really fully losing a league are just so slim, especially if you just relatively keep up with, your team throughout the season and just make changes and add and drop guys, make a little bit of trades here and there. You're not going to be last for sure. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about not being last, but just going and playing for first. And that's what taking De'Von Achane in the late second round is doing. He was literally one of the most efficient. He had literally one of the most efficient running back seasons ever by a halfback last year. Obviously, the volume drops, or obviously as volume increases, efficiency drops. That's just how it goes. But I won't really be some sort of major volume increase in terms of carries per game. It's just going to be the volume is going to go up because he's probably most likely going to play more games. Obviously, injury is a thing, but you can't really predict injuries for these certain guys unless it's someone like a Javonte Williams or someone like that who just has this catastrophic injury and you just want to stay away from them. Achane didn't really have that. He had like a normal injury, so it's not like that's going to happen all the time, every single time. It could, but I don't think you should bank on that because there's a lot of guys that dropped after a year of them being just having a normal injury and then they go back up. I mean, look at Christian McCaffrey. The last 2 years he was in Carolina, he got injured and then didn't play the rest of the year because the team sucked and they said, hey, you don't need to play. But some people don't remember that. They just remember that Christian McCaffrey didn't play for them in the final games or whatever and that he was a bust. Well, guess what? He ended up being insane the next 2 years. So just keep in mind, if it's not a major injury that people are telling you to worry about, don't 100% avoid them. Because if you avoid guys that get hurt and say, I'm going to go for this other guy that hasn't gotten hurt, you're going to get bit a lot of times and not really take advantage of fully guys. Sometimes you just got to forget certain years, okay? Especially if it has just regular injuries. But he ended up missing 6 total games last year, which you would have thought it'd be a little more, but it was only 6 games. He was 4th in points per game during that time. Nothing has really changed besides the defense getting worse, which can create more possessions for the offense. They did obviously lose Robert Hunt, which, is a little bit of a concern, but he honestly... I think he was pretty well-rounded. It wasn't like he was the most insane run blocker. He was a little bit better of a pass blocker, but I think that hurts a little bit, but I don't think that's really going to fully affect De'Von Achane's skill because he can just run to the outside with his speed, so it's not like he's relying on moving the ball down the middle, which that's what Robert Hunt was. He was a guard for them. But Mostert around him is getting older. Obviously, he had most of the carries, but he's not going to have the same carries that he had last year. They did draft Jalen Wright out of Tennessee, but I don't see him taking major carries, especially, he could play really well, but there's no way he's going to play as good as De'Von Achane did. So I think Achane will still be a very high priority for them because they just drafted him. And he was relatively high when they took him. So I think go ahead, go for the W. He could easily be a top 5 halfback, and you're getting him at number 10. And worst case scenario, he gets injured, but that's the case with every single player. Every single player has that. And every single player has had a year where they got injured, came back the next year, and succeeded. So don't let that stop you from drafting Achane. You could go with an absolute elite level wide receiver in the beginning, and then go ahead and snag Achane in the second round, and then get another receiver going back. And then boom, you got a running back 1 and potentially a high wide receiver 1 and maybe a lower tier wide receiver 1, and that's an amazing start if you have a pick earlier in your draft. So go ahead and look at De'Von Achane if you're around that area. Next is going to be Kenneth Walker, former Michigan State Spartan. Shout out to the Spartans. He's going as running back 16, which is around the late 3rd round, and that's pretty consistent for every single site that I see. So kind of a slightly higher tier running back 2. And I'm not necessarily dying on the hill for this particular running back that I kind of was for De'Von Achane, but I still think the range that he's going in, it's just a good pick. It's just like, hey, this is an actual good pick. It's not a bad pick at any point. If you draft him where he's going, it's just good. He's not brutally undervalued, but I think just look at the guys that are going around him is kind of why I have him on this list. Alvin Kamara, older, and a really bad O-line. Rachaad White, not, in my opinion, a good starting halfback, to be honest. He's just not. He's one of the worst starting halfbacks. He's not a bad player at all, but if you look at starting running backs, he's in the bottom, 4 or 3. And, now, he's got a limited ceiling as well, and they're only going to pass more with Jalen McMillan, who they added, who looks great in camp, and they have Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, who also need the ball, and Baker Mayfield, they just paid money, so they're going to be passing way more. Josh Jacobs is around that range, which in Green Bay, Matt LaFleur never gives a running back a full starting role, ever. That's why free Aaron Jones was a thing, because they like to split the backfield up, which I think in some cases is good and some is bad. But in fantasy perspective, obviously you don't love that. So Jacobs, who is more of a volume back anyways, that's pretty, demeaning for his fantasy value. Aaron Jones, who's now on the Vikings, but is on a potentially poor passing offense, with the quarterbacks that they have now. And now there's going to be more attention going to him in the run game, and he's going to be nearly 30 with recent injury history last year. I would take Walker over all these guys, and some of them are ranked higher and some of them are ranked lower. They're all in the same bubble. I would easily snag Walker out of all of those group guys, so I think that's why the value is really good. He's in a new regime with Washington's offensive coordinator who does like to pass, and they will pass, but not at an insane volume. And people forget Washington's running back last year, Washington University, which is where the OC is from, he had over 1,000 yards and wasn't really super efficient. So he gave him a lot of carries, and he reached 1,000 yards. But I think Kenneth Walker is obviously immensely better because I just think he's so talented. I just believe in the talent. I think he's one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. I think he's one of the most underrated running backs in the NFL. And along with the situation, the O-line obviously took a bit of a dip, but I think that more so affects Geno Smith and the passing upside rather than Kenneth Walker, because I think Kenneth Walker can overcome that. And his backup, Zach Charbonnet, doesn't really seem to be a guy that must go on the field, and now the regime that drafted him is not there anymore. So obviously that's a bit concerning for him. But again, I just believe in the talent. I think he's super talented. Don't reach for him, but I think the tier that he's in, I would take him every single time around the guys. If I'm looking for a running back and the receivers kind of fell off, and they're, you don't want to reach for a receiver, go ahead, take Kenneth Walker in that, late third round range, mid third round range. I would take him over all those running backs every single time. Next, we're going to take a bit of a dip down to Tyjae Spears at running back 34. Around the mid 8th round is his average draft position. Now, he is going to obviously stay on the same team he was, but it's very different. New regime, new players around him, and now he has Tony Pollard near him. And I was thinking about having Pollard on this list, but I'm going with Tyjae Spears because he's cheaper and probably at this moment a better athlete and player than Tony Pollard, in my opinion. Pollard is not going to come in and get the same amount of carries that Derrick Henry had. Obviously, Derrick Henry is gone. Tyjae Spears, who is going into his second season, split carries with Derrick Henry, not fully. He got just the carries that Henry didn't get, which Henry was still crazy efficient for his horrendous O-line they had last year. But Pollard's not going to come in and immediately take all the carries that Henry had. So Spears is already going to be gaining carries that he didn't get last year. They spent money to help the offensive line. Lloyd Cushenberry from the Denver Broncos. They drafted J.C. Latham in the first round. Peter Skronsky they drafted last year in the first round at Northwestern at guard, who I think is going to get much better in year 2. So the quarterback they have is going into year 2, and I think will improve. They now have a new offensive head coach, who I think, a lot of people don't know a ton about, but I would assume he would benefit from having at least that type of coach, over someone who's just, maybe not fully, up to date and aware of offensive schemes and stuff. And I think if Pollard goes down, Tyjae Spears is automatically a top 20 halfback at the minimum, which he might be even higher at running back 15 or so. I think him going into year 2, he's getting more carries. He's going to have a better offensive line. So everything's improving, but he's not skyrocketing really as high as you would think. I mean, running back 34 is not a starting running back, and it's barely a flex spot. And your flex spot, you got to, compete. You most likely have certain maybe wide receivers that are in that flex spot. So I think just the value there, you could just get him, and he could potentially be your RB2 if you have elite level wide receivers, tight ends, and flex spot, and it would be an awesome value for you. So I do really like Tyjae Spears going around mid 8th round for your fantasy draft. Next is going to be another dip, but this is, I know it seems a little weird that we have Jaleel McLaughlin on this list, but undersized and not an amazing offense, but I do think he's just, the running back room for the Broncos is not solidified, and McLaughlin has the clearest path to the most playing time. He played significant snaps in 4 games. His average points per game was 12.6, which would have put him at running back 18 last year. Javonte Williams has struggled to come back, unfortunately, from his bad injury that could really have affected him and his career. They have Samaje Perine and Audric Estime. I'm not high on any of them, and I don't think any of them are going to be taking major carries away from any player on this team. And I think he could just naturally be the starting halfback for an NFL team, which is not going to put you at running back 51. That's just not the case. And if Williams is out, I think he's a pretty good starter in one of your two halfback slots that you can get great value on because he's going in late round 13. Late round 13 at around running back 51. He might end up climbing as the season goes on. But again, I don't think this offense is going to be insane, but I think, in cases where you have, running backs and receivers, I think Flock Fantasy, who's a really good follow on he's a really good subscription on YouTube. He does a lot of good fantasy videos. He was bringing up how good offenses correlate to fantasy points. And obviously, the better the offense, the better fantasy production you're going to have from their players. But receivers relied on it way more than running backs did. And so I think you can still have a relatively successful running back, season and value in fantasy like a Derrick Henry did, without having an elite offense. Whereas it seems like wide receivers kind of do really rely on that. And you have little areas. I mean, there are some outliers, but the percentages are much lower. So if you're thinking about how bad of an offense it might be, again, I don't think it's going to be insanely bad. While it will be below average, it's not going to be insanely bad. And I think, why would you not take him if he could potentially... He's already going to be a halfback 2 immediately. He had very good games when he played. And the guy above him has had major injury issues, and the team that was with him didn't draft him. I think if he ends up being the, halfback 1 with some split carries, but still the RB1 on the team, and you get him in the 13th round, that's great value. So I would look at Jaleel McLaughlin if you need some running back help or just want to wait on running back for your fantasy team. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this guy because I did recently have him when I made the script, but after viewing some stuff, apparently his coach came out and said he needs to, potentially improve or stay healthy if he wants to stay on the team. So that's pretty concerning. Some coaches obviously are a little more harsh than others, but just if you want to think about it, he's the same price and kind of similar situation as Jaleel McLaughlin, running back 52, late 13th round, which is going to go down even more now. But he, was fine in, time that he had. But he did start the final 2 games, and he would have been a starting caliber halfback there. Alvin Kamara is older and injury prone. Jamal Williams was not good last year. Could be a starting halfback for them. Obviously, it'd be one of the worst, but it would be a starting halfback. For getting him in the late 13th round, that's pretty good value. But they also have the easiest strength of schedule for a running back. So maybe that could really help you later on down the line if Williams, obviously you're not going to draft Jamal Williams. And if Alvin Kamara is potentially injured at that end of the year, you get a starting halfback for a team that has the easiest, strength of schedule for running back during the playoff time. So pretty good value. I'm not going to die on a hill telling you to take him, but you could still look at it. And then the final 2 are any Bears halfback other than Swift. Don't take Swift. Don't do it. I might do a video of the worst values. Do not take Swift. Absolutely not. Go ahead. I don't know which one. Whichever one you want is fine, but either Roschon Johnson or Khalil Herbert. Go ahead and take one of them. Roschon is younger. Obviously, maybe has a little bit higher upside, but maybe they like Herbert more in terms of he's a little more steady. I don't really care which one you go with, but I think either one is fine. Roschon is cheaper, so if you just want to go ahead and do that, that's fine. But I think Herbert is listed as RB2, so if you want to, if you want to get a guy that maybe could play more immediately, get Herbert. If you want to get a guy that you want to maybe count on the upside, go ahead and get Roschon. Just get, if you are looking at a value maybe later on in Bears running backs, look at one of these 2 because Swift is not going to be a good value in fantasy. I can assure you that. Before I get into the receivers that I listed specifically for this video, I want to quickly get into 2 guys that I, couldn't fit in. First one is going to be Nico Collins. Now, Nico Collins obviously had an amazing breakout season last year with C.J. Stroud, and it was obviously phenomenal and unexpected. The reason I bring him up is not necessarily because he's going around a place that I think is insane value, because he's going, around 15. but that Stephon Diggs is going 20th and Tank Dell is going 29th. So they're not insanely far from each other. In fact, I think Tank Dell might be even higher in other areas, so you could have him around the T. Higgins, Amari Cooper range. So let's say he's around 26, 25, and then Diggs is, probably around 18, 19, and then Collins is here. You do have three specific, slight gaps, but I think he's clearly by far the best in terms of if you want to go and get a Texans wide receiver. I would not get Stephon Diggs. I would not get Tank Dell because Diggs, I think, is just not as good as he was, just straight up. He's older. Unfortunately, he's going to be commanding more targets, and his personality obviously demands that, and you could already see it from the sideline of him talking with C.J. Stroud. Stroud's probably going to hate that, but he's going to have to get used to it. But I just don't think he's as good as he was. He's going to be a good receiver in general, but I don't know if he's as good of a fantasy receiver because he's not the number one option. He shouldn't be. And then Tank Dell is very talented, but he's very thin. He literally weighs almost the same as me, and I'm skinny as crap. I need to get in the gym, which I'm trying to do. But he's skinny as in he's obviously built, and I'm not at all. But for NFL standards, it's very worrisome. He obviously had a pretty gruesome injury last year. It seems like he's making a recovery fine, but I'm very worried about him being injured. So if you want to go ahead and get any of the Houston receivers, I would definitely say Nico is totally fine getting there. Next guy is going to be Chris Godwin. Now, Chris Godwin, obviously not the flashiest name, but I think he's being drafted kind of closer to his floor. He is going to be playing reportedly in the slot more this year than he was last year, which that's where he's had amazing fantasy success before. He's literally a few years ago been a wide receiver 1. He's also been a wide receiver 2 multiple times, and he's being drafted around like wide receiver 30, 33, somewhere around there. So it's very good value. You can get him in like the 5th or 6th round, maybe even later. Nothing besides, the quarterbacks or him being in the slot is really changed. I will say, obviously, Dave Canales leaving, I do think takes a little bit of a hit, but you could still get good fantasy production from Chris Godwin, even if Baker Mayfield throws an extra pick or two a game or makes an extra bad play or two a game, and the Bucs just don't succeed as much as they think. Chris Godwin could still get a ton of run because they're going to be wanting to throw the ball a lot because they got Godwin, Mike Evans, and now Jalen McMillan, who has had a very good camp so far. So it's going to be a pass-heavy offense, and he's a proven good wide receiver, only 28 years old, so I think that's pretty good value wherever you can get him. But the first main guy on the list is going to be Michael Pittman Jr. for the Indianapolis Colts. He is going around wide receiver 18, and you can get him around the late 2nd to early 3rd round. Now, he's being drafted for his ADP as if nothing around him has really changed. His play style is one that I don't think really requires amazing QB accuracy. He's obviously a big body, go up and get it receiver, but he's still, pretty athletic for his size. He has Anthony Richardson now, who I think can really improve in passing, but it's honestly not going to be too different from Gardner Minshew, if we're being really honest. If Anthony Richardson gets hurt, which is a possibility because of his style of play, he's got Joe Flacco as a backup, which would be amazing for him because Joe Flacco last year obviously just chucked it, let it out, just let it loose, went everywhere, and that would be amazing for Michael Pittman to have someone like that because Joe Flacco last year was absolutely a starting caliber quarterback. So even if you're like, hey, his quarterback might get injured, you still got a great one, or not I don't want to say great one, but a great backup behind him who's very capable of giving good fantasy production. He has another year of Josh Downs next to him, who has had a little bit of injury stuff apparently in camp. But then A.D. Mitchell was drafted, but I don't really think he's ready to steal major targets right now. And then the tight end situation isn't really anyone who's going to do that either. So the only thing that's changed has been A.D. Mitchell, and I don't think he's going to have an impact a ton year one. So if anything, I would say it's improved because of the quarterback situation. And he's by far the clear wide receiver 1 and the number 1 target getter in a Shane Steichen offense, who I think is one of the best offensive minds in football, or one of the best unproven offensive minds, because I don't think people fully realize the scale of how good he is, because you just haven't seen the team's success because he's had injury stuff for the first year with Indianapolis. But if they're fully healthy now, I think people will see how good he is and how good he can run an offense. And wide receiver 18 to 19 is around the floor, especially, that's for other sites. But oddly enough, ESPN, last time I checked, had him around wide receiver 12. So that was very interesting to see that. Maybe it'll go down slightly. But wide receiver 12, that's slightly around his ceiling. So that wouldn't be, not fully ideal. But if you can just get him around if you have to do mid-second round, I'm okay with that, because I think he's a very safe wide receiver who you will probably potentially get as your wide receiver 2 if you draft a wide receiver in the first round, which majority of people will. But even if you get a running back, the place you'll get a running back in, Pittman probably won't fully be the guy to take there anyways. There'll probably be a receiver that falls. So I think he's going in a really good spot. You could even get him in the third round. And as you can see, his strength of schedule for receivers is not bad. It's pretty good, number 6. So I think Michael Pittman Jr. is a pretty good value in fantasy this year. Next one is going to be Jalen Waddle, one of my favorite receivers coming out of college at Alabama, and he has clearly lived up to the hype. He is going as wide receiver 19, so right below Michael Pittman, also late second, early third round pick. I just love him as a player. I'm just not really sure why he's going near his floor, to be honest. Defense, obviously, for the team changed a lot, but aside from small offensive line changes and an old Odell Beckham Jr., Waddle is still going to command the same target share, and the offense is still going to be the same and relatively similar. I think you should expect positive touchdown regression. He only had 4 touchdowns last year out of 30 passing touchdowns that Tua Tagovailoa passed for. So Waddle will definitely command more touchdowns this season. I can guarantee it, which, it's hard to say because obviously touchdowns are volatile, but I just think a player of this caliber and the way the offense is, he's not going to have 4 or less touchdowns this upcoming season. His yards per route run last year was the highest of his career. So even if the full, yards/touchdowns don't really show on the stat sheet, because statistically his second season, which was 2 years ago, was better than last season, his yards per route run was still better, which yards per route run is a very good indicator of how good a receiver is. Slightly, what's around him, obviously, but it's a pretty solid indicator, and it was even better last year. So he's just waiting to explode. I know the team strength of schedule is around 8th, so it's not going to be an insane strength of schedule for the team. I know it says 27th here. I think they are taking into account a little too much for certain teams they're playing. But still, I don't think you should really worry about him being 27th. I think that'll be higher anyways. But you can even see sometimes here, like it says ADP is 36 for different Fantasy Pros sites, or his draft rank is 33. So he could even go lower. You could probably get him in the, sometime close to the third round for different drafts like that. So, I do really love Jalen Waddle in terms of the value this year, and I think if he's your wide receiver 2, it's amazing. And if he's your 1, I think it's still possible he could be a wide receiver 1. I think he could be a wide receiver 12 or something like that. And if Tyreek Hill goes down, which is, I'm not saying will happen, but as a 30-year-old wide receiver is possible, Jalen Waddle is a top 7, option at receiver, which is a first-round pick. So I say why not? I don't think it can get much worse. So I think Waddle's a pretty great value here this year in fantasy. Next, we're going to take a pretty steep decline down, but a lot of the mid guys, I kind of mentioned Nico Collins, Chris Godwin, but we want to get value. And so Christian Watson, I think, going as wide receiver 41, mid 8th round, is a great value. Now, his fall is mainly due to his injury concerns, which are real, but I think him having a full year of recovery and now really, knowing how to play around his ankle situation, because I think the thing with him was they found out he had certain bones or whatever near his ankle or ligaments that were longer or bigger than others, so it kind of, made his stance and just running a little bit, unbalanced, but it seems like he's been working with a bunch of people to help fix that and get used to it and be able to play through that effectively. But I think the value for him as a guy who you're not even going to really rely on to start is just too much to pass up, because wide receiver 41 and going around the mid-8th round, if you just think about it, your 2 running backs, your 2 receivers, your tight end, your quarterback, your flex, and if you have a dual flex league or a triple wide receiver league, then you're at number 8, and you could take him. But if you do take him and you're in one of these leagues, you could just get a guy in the 9th round who just has a really high floor and you can consistently start, because this is just going to be a super high upside pick later on in the 8th round. So you don't even have to necessarily start him if you play your cards right. He only had 3 games after Love's big boom with him in week 11. So that's kind of what I'm mainly counting, is we're assuming that the reason, I think the Packers are too, because that's the reason they paid him a ton of money. But let's assume that Jordan Love is a little bit, maybe not the same, but just let's say he's relatively close to what he was the second half of the season, which was from week 11 on. And when Watson played with him during that time, he had 9 points, 18 points, and 24 points before he got injured. That's a wide receiver 1. So obviously it's a lower sample size and you can't fully rely on that. But I think you could say at least he could be a wide receiver 2 for sure, right? And you're drafting him as a partly flex play. So if you get both, like I said, get a quarterback and get a tight end before him, you can get a guy who's got a lower floor like DeAndre Hopkins or Deontay Johnson, around the same area as well, to fill that, if you have 2 flex spots or 3 wide receivers, which I play in a league with 2 running backs and 3 wide receivers. So you could get a D-Hop or Deontay Johnson or someone like that. Not saying those are the guys, but those are the higher floor people that are around his area. And then if Watson works out, you just got an insane value to go out and win your leagues. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to go win your leagues, not play for the middle, win your leagues. But I do bring up high floor guys because you have to have a mix of very high upside and high floor guys. Because if the high upside guys don't work, you can be able to fall back on other guys that are going to produce for you, while you can look for the extra roster spot by trading for someone else or going in free agency and picking up a guy that maybe has some high upside, or like a rookie or something that could end up winning you later on in the league. You got to have a mix. You can't go all in on high upside guys. You can't go all in on guys who are just going to be good and high floor. You got to have a mix. And Watson, I think the value he's at is a perfect example of that, of a guy that you should be targeting if you want to go out and win your leagues for high upside people. And am I guaranteeing he's going to stay healthy the whole year and succeed the whole year? No. But it's very possible, and the statistics show, and if he stays healthy, he could be an amazing pick for you. And as you see, strength of schedule is number 2 for wide receivers, so that's pretty good for him. He's only 25. I love it. So if you can go out there and get Christian Watson and your team structure says that you can, go ahead and do it. Next is going to be Curtis Samuel. He is wide receiver 49, around round 10 to 11. And I think what you need to do is just look at his competition for targets. Obviously, the Bills changed a ton about their offense, but just the competition for targets is wide open. I think Keon Coleman fell into a great situation. That's the receiver they just drafted out of Florida State. But I don't think he's going to have true wide receiver 1 targets, at least this season. And I know a lot of people are obviously have doubts about him as a prospect, which I'm kind of in the middle. I see both sides, but I'm not fully, think he's a bust or think he's amazing. I see both. I'm kind of in the middle, but he's not going to be a wide receiver, for sure wide receiver 1 for them this season in terms of targets. That's just not going to happen. Khalil Shakir is not bad, but he's nothing special really in the slot. MVS is there. Mac Hollins is there. Chase Claypool just got cut. So Curtis Samuel, who is going to be a starter, is largely forgotten and is fully healthy now. He has some pretty high rushing upside as well to get some rushing touchdowns on end arounds and jet sweeps. That's what he did in Carolina a lot. He, last year was his best yards per route run since 2020, which was his best fantasy season of his career with Carolina. He's only 28 years old, so he's not 30 or anything. He's still got, in his prime. And last year he his average, I think, was around 51, wide receiver 51. And now he's being drafted pretty much at the same spot with Josh Allen as his quarterback now. in that offense, this is a pretty great value as well. I would say Curtis Samuel, who I did just draft in a league recently, would be a great pickup for you in terms of value there. So go ahead and look at Curtis Samuel later on in your drafts. Next is going to be Josh Palmer. He is going around wide receiver 58. He's wide receiver 66 on ESPN. Just wanted to point that out, which is around round 13 or so. And this is a similar situation to Curtis Samuel. So many targets were lost. Mike Williams and Keenan Allen both gone. They added DJ Chark and Ladd McConkey. Neither of them are going to make up for the total targets that were lost from Mike Williams and Keenan Allen. Although I do love Ladd McConkey, and it seems like DJ Chark is getting good, praise out of camp. He was horrendous with Carolina, but maybe in a better offense he could be at least a little bit better. But Palmer has been a guy who's just been consistently good when given time to step in. He's also had time with Justin Herbert already, so he, has Justin Herbert as a quarterback, which is pretty good in general. And he jumped from 1.2 yards per route run for his first 2 seasons to last year in year 3, he had 1.71 yards per route run. So a pretty major leap there. He's improved every single year he's been in the NFL. He's only 24 years old. He was a former, I believe, 3rd-round pick out of Tennessee. So I think, obviously, you can see strength of schedule 13th, pretty good. Like I said, ESPN has him so low. His roster percentage is 14%. I would say, in terms of if you're looking at the very end of your draft, this would be a very good pick. I don't know how he's 14%, ranked. I think a lot of it is just the lack of depth in terms of leagues that are, bench spots, how many bench spots they have, which I have a league that's, I think, 7 bench spots, so it's 1 extra. I think the normal is 6. But especially in those leagues or deeper leagues, for sure, go get Josh Palmer. He's going to get more targets. He's going to improve, and I don't see how he would be drafted. I mean, ESPN wide receiver 66, I just think it's crazy. I think they have certain guys they're maybe thinking, just throwing guys up there, hey, this guy might be good, this guy might be good. Josh Palmer will for sure be a starter. There's not going to be a time where he's ever going to be jumped. I know they have a lot of receivers there, but he's the one consistent guy there that they know about. And he hasn't had major injury history at all. He's been with Herbert before. I just think it's very good value down there at wide receiver 58. And then this last one is all the way down. You might not want to draft him, but maybe at the very end in deeper leagues, or just definitely keep an eye on him in free agency. And that's Demarcus Robinson. I didn't want to do too many guys that you weren't going to draft. But this is one I did want to mention because you might just say, hey, all these guys are close. It doesn't matter. Let me just snag them. If you have a lot of younger guys on your team and you want someone who's just really actually has a good consistent role to playing time, that's Demarcus Robinson. He is around wide receiver 80, round 18, which is basically just a free agent. He's a starting wide receiver for Matthew Stafford. I'd say that's pretty good. But both of the wide receivers that are next to him are currently or within the past year have had injury issues. And that is Puka Nacua apparently right now, and then obviously with Cooper Kupp last year and maybe a little bit this year. His total points per game of the season last year in total was around 8 points per game, which would have been wide receiver 48. So obviously wide receiver 80 is pretty good. But if you look into it deeper, if you only do the games where he started, meaning that, he was obviously the starting wide receiver because they had some kind of injuries. So that'd be wide receiver 2. He had averaged 11.1 points per game, and that would make him wide receiver 28. So that is a lower, not quite a wide receiver 2, but almost, but definitely a flex play, potentially if you do have injuries, but he's starting right now. He's listed as the starter. He's obviously not going to get targets, he did, but I'm not very, hey, no, Puka and Cooper Kupp are for sure going to be healthy this year. No, that's not the case at all, and that would put him right in the spot of what he did last year, where he was wide receiver 28. So I don't see how you wouldn't at least keep an eye on him in terms of your free agency and stuff for a guy where, hey, if you look at someone like 2 guys I'm going to list now, Malachi Corley, who you might have to draft, but maybe not. If you look at Malachi Corley, who on the Jets, really, I love him as a sleeper wide receiver. I just think him as a prospect I really like. He's basically a Deebo Samuel-esque player. He's like Deebo Samuel light. He's got a ton of potential. He's played halfback and corner before. His yards, he's a yak monster, yards after catch. He's currently listed as the backup slot to Xavier Gipson, but I don't think that's going to last a long time. And his other receivers are Mike Williams and Allen Lazard. So I think him or someone like Ricky Pearsall, if there's a potential trade with Brandon Ayuk, he will immediately be a wide receiver too, with Ayuk being gone. And he's very talented, and it would be an amazing pick. So if you look at, or maybe Jermaine Burton, who is also in a situation where he's got Joe Burrow as his quarterback, and T. Higgins, who has some contract issues and was injured last year, and the slot position is not fully set. So younger guys who are on teams with good quarterbacks, if you look at those players and maybe draft them, Demarcus Robinson would be a great guy to star, because if they're not playing right now, you could look at Demarcus Robinson literally as the last pick in your draft or a free agent and say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and pick him up, and he'll be a good, value there. So that is going to be all the receivers. Now let's go ahead. I don't have a ton of tight ends, but let's get into the 2 tight ends that I do have listed. First one is going to be Kyle Pitts. I know some people are obviously done with Kyle Pitts completely, but I think they're just biting the bullet a little too early. He is currently going around tight end 7, around the mid 5th, early 6th round. Yes, I know he has not lived up to his potential or hype, but I promise this is going to be the year that he does. He finally has a quarterback with Kirk Cousins on his team. Kirk has always given his tight ends production, obviously going to TJ Hawkinson, but also Logan Thomas back when he was in Washington, and Logan Thomas was in his prime and actually was a pretty underrated receiver there. Both of those had very good wide receiver or tight end 1 production. I'm not worried about the talent at all. I'm not really worried about, him or London, in terms of them losing targets, because those are basically the only 2 guys that are going to get some. I know they signed Darnell Mooney, but Mooney is not going to command targets, and I think last year he was just terrible. He was not good. Maybe they can get him back to being a solid receiver, but he's not going to demand anything. And I think, Kyle Pitts, who is going, I think, to score, which this might seem crazy, but when you look at the number, I think you could totally see it. Kyle Pitts is going to score more touchdowns this upcoming season than he has in his entire career. He's scored six touchdowns for his career. He will score the same, if not more, touchdowns this season. And if it's not, it's because he got 5 or something. So he will for sure improve in the touchdown marks, which is why he's not lived up to the hype. It's just because of the touchdown stuff that he's had. But now he's got a quarterback. It's going to be better. They're going to score more. As a Panthers fan, it hurts, but I am all in on this Atlanta offense, and they're going to be very sneaky. And definitely keep an eye out on them for this upcoming season. But Kyle Pitts, I think, is great value in terms of, you still have to get him in a spot, but I think for someone who other people obviously clearly believe in at tight end 7, I think he could easily be a top 4 tight end, maybe even higher, if he gets the ball enough, because the talent is unquestioned. I think he's clearly talented. It's just, can he get the touchdowns and can he get the targets, which I think will happen. And then the last guy, a little bit of a boring one, but we'll still do it, and that's Hunter Henry. And this is mainly for ESPN. ESPN, he is at tight end 25. But he's at tight end 18 everywhere else. He's going around round 14. But I ask you the question, what is a rookie's best friend? I'll give you a second. It's a tight end. A tight end is a rookie's best friend, and they have got so many wide receivers over there, but Henry is the consistent option for tight end. He was tight end 15 in points per game for the terrible team that was the New England Patriots last year. So I don't know how he's down 10 tight end spots just from probably quarterback upgrades and maybe offensive upgrades. We don't really know, but even if it's relatively similar, why would he be going down that much? There's not 10 other tight ends that are just going to suddenly skyrocket. That's just not going to happen. The offense obviously is going to be so great, but Henry is not going to be so great. Sorry. But he can still outperform his ADP. And if you want to go heavy and get elite guys elsewhere, you can maybe coast with Henry, and he'll be obviously a low tight end 1 in terms of, tight end 15 is not a top 12 tight end, but you're getting him for free basically. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, you could maybe just go, hey, I'll kind of coast tight end and see what's out there, and maybe snag Hunter Henry and then look at guys that are good, which a guy I wanted to add to this list, Luke Musgrave for the Packers, someone that's going around a similar range, tight end 17. ESPN is going much higher, but if you want to look at a Luke Musgrave, Hunter Henry duo, because all of your other positions are elite in terms of all your flex spots, your quarterback, at least one of your running backs, and the other running back is probably really good, you could look at a young Musgrave who's got upside, young, and could command targets there because there's not really one set guy besides Christian Watson when he's on the field for the Packers that is going to demand targets. And then Hunter Henry, who's just going to have a really high floor. And I think I'm just not sure why on ESPN he's so low. So I think that'd be pretty good value there. But that will do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I might have some more stuff out in the future. I'm going to be, not doing a crazy amount of content on YouTube, but I will try and get at least a little bit. But I will be doing some more stuff on my podcast. That's going to start back up as NFL season comes up. I'm going to have probably a video or a podcast episode out maybe sometime this week or so. Maybe next weekend is when I'll get it out. But keep an eye on that. And I'll do another fantasy video for you. I'll do the best or the worst picks that you can make, the worst values in fantasy. So keep an eye out for that in the future as well as a prediction video. I'll probably do one with Mathis / on my podcast. We'll predict the season, give our yearly predictions, but I'll put a separate video out just going through quickly each team of, hey, this is what I think, because the division dive-in series I did, it was fun, but it takes so much time, and I just don't have the time right now. Maybe next year when I graduate college, hopefully I can start doing that stuff. But just keep an eye out for content in the future for my podcast, which covers NFL, college football, and basketball. NBA is not in season right now, but any other important news that's going on, and then this channel that will have more stuff out. So, as always, thank you for watching. Stay smart, stay sharp, and I will see you guys later. Peace.